riffs are too repetitive, the lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides and the cover art's a mess. There's so much here to tear apart. Listen to it for a week, now that we has passed. It's Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Why I Hate This Album. I am one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey. Not with me, as always, co-host extraordinaire Timothy Richardson. Don't worry, Tim is absolutely fine. But when you do a show with a Tim, you got to recognize occasionally that Tim is going to disappear for long periods of time with absolutely no explanation. Or at least mine does. So, in those events, I prepare a solo cast. Not always, because, I have a real life and a real job, kinda. But you guys freak out if we take a week off, so I try to always have something prepared for just such an occasion. And this week, boy, do I have something prepared. Guys, I have done a deep dive on the performance artist, punk rocker known as GG Allin. Hopefully you saw the title, not a shock. What is a shock is how many people have never heard of this guy. I grew up in the late 80s and 90s hearing about how this guy was instrumental in punk music and how he never sold out and he really was the true rock and roll. I had also heard stories that he used to poop on stage and would roll around in it. So I pretty much avoided all things GG Allin. That is until today. I have been doing an exhaustive amount of research on this man and his life in an effort to understand, was he truly an important cog in the wheel that is the music industry, or was he simply just a stunt artist looking to get some attention, a less talented proto-jackass, if you will? What's my conclusion? You're gonna have to wait to find out. But I gotta warn you guys, this story is insane. It's beyond insane. I don't think there's enough trigger warnings in the world for the things I'm going to tell you guys. Now, I did break it into two parts as I am prone to do. Also, it's a pretty long story. The first half, slightly less upsetting. Slightly. But guys, let me give you some categories here. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, nudity, scatological things, uncomfortable stories about masturbation, and not in a fun way. But these are just a few of the topics that we must explore in the life of GG Allin. And I gotta tell you, if you think any one of the ones I just listed are gross, wait till you see how he does it. It's way grosser. And we're a pretty open-minded podcast, so that says a lot. It is still a very interesting story. As you might have noticed, it's going to take me 2 full episodes to do it. I think if we did a back-to-back 2 hours, it might be a little much, but if we break it up into 2-hour segments, I think it'll be at least stomachable. Before we get into the solo cast itself, as always, guys, we want to hear from you. Reach out, hatePodMail@gmail.com. That's the email address. If you have a minute, please throw the 5 stars in the Apple Podcast app. It makes a world of difference, and it takes 2 seconds. So if you've never done it, please, we invite you. Just takes a moment. We also have Instagram, that's HatePod. There is Twitter, that's Album HatePod, or you can reach out to me directly, G Harvey Tweets on Twitter. All right, guys, that's all the formalities out of the way. Let's get down to business. I've given you all the warnings. From this point forward, listener discretion is advised. Things are about to get weird. I give you the life of Mr. GG Allin. In 1953, 32-year-old Merle Colby Allin of Grovetown, New Hampshire, married 20-year-old Arleta Marie Gunther of Gilman, Vermont. He was a paper mill worker, and she was trying to escape her overprotective German mother. It was curious that a 32-year-old Merle was still unmarried, and it may have had something to do with him being a massive prick that was super into God, but in more of an Old Testament sort of way, eye for an eye sort of thing. Luckily for him, Arleta was sheltered most of her life and wasn't allowed to date many other men, and she likely married Merle just to get away from her mother. In 1953, they had a son and named him Merle Colby Allin Jr., as was the style at the time. 3 years later, on August 29th, 1956, they had their second son, Jesus Christ Allin. Now, the reason he was given this name is because his father told his wife that Jesus Christ, OG Jesus Christ, had visited him and told him that his newborn son would be a great man, like a Messiah. As is common with little kids, Jesus' older brother had a very hard time pronouncing his brother's name, and so instead it came out as JJ, which later became Gigi. So, for the purposes of brevity and just overall simplicity, from here on out, I'm just going to refer to him as Gigi. Don't worry, he's not Jesus long. The family spent the first 5 years living in a log cabin in Northumberland, New Hampshire. They had no running water, very little heat, and even less personal space. The family was no strangers to violence at the hands of their father, a religious fanatic that did not waste time with threats. Gigi even claims that their their father Merle would remind him and his brother that ultimately he had planned on killing the boys, and then his mother and he would commit suicide. He even went so far as to dig graves in the basement. I have no idea if this was just an elaborate threat to get the boys to do their homework, or if he was really preparing to murder them and his wife. Either way, the man dug graves. He did other really crazy shit too, like demanding that their mother provide him with sex whenever he demanded it, and if she refused, he would drag their mattress out of the house and then set it on fire in protest. As you might have guessed, they did try to escape. On the first attempt, they were thwarted when GG was kidnapped by his father in the process, and then held for ransom until his mother and brother returned to the cabin. It took an entire 5 years and several more failed attempts before GG's mother took the two boys and as much as they could carry and left the cabin while Merle Sr. was at work at the paper mill. Promptly after escaping, Arleta found a lawyer, filed for divorce, and had GG's name legally changed from Jesus Christ to Kevin Michael Allin. With almost no money and even less options, the three stayed in a home on the land owned by Arleta's mother. Just a few years prior, Arleta sought refuge with Merle from her mother, and now she was doing the exact same thing in reverse. Now, since there wasn't really any daycare and they didn't have enough money, when their mom wasn't home, the boys were left to stay with their grandmother, who they hated. She would scream and beat them and threaten to lock them in the basement, but in reality, they probably were very poorly behaved boys and might have deserved at least some of that. By 1962, the divorce had gone through and Arleta was keeping the family afloat working at a jewelry store. Once free of her ex, Arleta showed that she had a thing for abusive, mildly psychotic guys with very little regard for human life. Her overprotective mother turned out to be a godsend for chasing away a parade of men turned ex-lovers who would terrorize the family at the drop of a hat. But leaving the house wasn't much better for the boys. GG hated school. He had terrible asthma and would miss large stretches of class during the year, especially during those early years when you learn the basics, and he never really caught up. Add to that he didn't fit in at all, and he kind of had the feeling that both his classmates and his teachers really wished he wasn't there. As if all that wasn't enough, GG also had a small bladder, and his teachers just assumed he was lying every time he asked to go to the bathroom because that's what little kids do when they want attention or feel like leaving class for 5 minutes. But GG wasn't lying. He really did need to go, and on more than one occasion, he pissed himself in front of the other kids. But since it was 1963 or so, the teacher made GG stand in the corner of the room in his pee pants so that he could think about how rude it was for him to warn his teacher that he needed to urinate and then urinating all over himself when he wasn't allowed to leave the room and go urinate. Folks, I had teachers like this. Luckily, I didn't pee myself, but they're out there scarring children every day. So, just listen to your kids when they say they have a bad day. Between the missed class for asthma and the urine shenanigans, GG was put in a series of special classes to help him catch up. But to paraphrase Bart Simpson, and apparently a very young GG Allin, it was super unclear to anyone how the class was going to catch up to everyone by going at a slower pace. And it turned out that's exactly right. GG was forced to repeat the 3rd grade and watch his older brother Merle go on to 5th. Growing up with his mother and brother, the house was always filled with the music of Jerry Lee Lewis or Johnny Cash, and by 1965, GG was looking to expand his exposure to other bands. He joined a record club where he got new albums by bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Herman's Hermits, and he was instantly hooked. He only wanted to listen to rock and roll, talk about rock and roll, and soon play rock and roll. But first, he did have to pass the 3rd grade, and luckily he did, and even made friends with 2 guys named Tom Stewart and Randy White, both of whom shared his interest in all things rock. Since none of them had any instruments yet, they mostly just talked about music, listened to records, and chased around this poor kid named Brian Roy, who they just all hated, and when they caught up to him, they just beat the shit out of him. It was a terrible game. They would invite the kid over just to harass him. Eventually, this instrumentless band gang started referring to themselves as the Purple Spiders. Eventually, they did manage to cobble together some cheap instruments and begin messing around, but they never really formed anything that resembled a band. Part of the reason was because GG's asthma was getting worse. Much of his time was spent visiting a quote-unquote specialist in Burlington, Virginia, to get upwards of 18 shots per visit. Now, of course, I have absolutely no idea what asthma treatment would involve that many shots in a single sitting. I am not a doctor, but it sounds like this guy might have been experimenting on kids. I'm just saying. But the upside to this regular needle torture, aside from continuing to live, allegedly, was the free album that GG would get for being a good sport from his mom. She would allow GG to select one item if he agreed to take the drive to what I suspect was a lunatic in Vermont experimenting on children. But I have no proof, so allegedly to all of this. By 1967, Arleta was tired of dealing with her mother again and moved the family to Lunenburg, Vermont to live temporarily with family friends while she found a new home. By this time, GG was 11 going into 6th grade and he was starting to notice women. While it's not terribly unusual for this to happen, what GG did about it was a little less normal. GG would go into the bathroom after a woman had finished showering, whether he was related to them or not, in the hopes of stealing her used underpants to add to his growing collection. Eventually, they moved out of the friend's house, robbing GG of his ever-growing supply of underpants, and they moved into a house on Main Street in Lunenburg. While GG didn't have a whole lot of luck at school, he did manage to cobble together a band with David Niffen, who moved in down the street. But since they were both drummers, they needed a third. Luckily, David knew a guy who played guitar named Dennis Silver, and the Silver Band was born. GG and David split drumming duties at first, but quickly GG began to gravitate towards being the front man. They weren't great, but they made up for it with enthusiasm and mild destruction that was likely considered scandalous for the 60s. They even managed to get some local gigs at schools and dance halls. Also around this time, among the men GG's mom was dating was a guy named John Baird, who she would eventually marry a year later. Baird's father was a musician, and so GG and his brother would often go to his house and attend jam sessions. By 7th grade, GG had two big events happen. The first, his mother and stepdad got him a snare drum. The second was that he hit puberty and began to spend almost all of his free time in his room. Unfortunately for GG and anyone else around him, this was not just a phase. GG Allin became a chronic masturbator. And I do mean chronic, like way too much. Anyway, as GG was getting ready to start the 8th grade, the family moved to a house just outside of Littleton, New Hampshire, where his parents got jobs working in a shoe factory, and GG got a job down at the end of the road at a restaurant called the Lobster Tub. By 1969, GG was 13 and hanging out almost exclusively with his brother and his friend Alan Chappell, a long-haired guitar player that was way cooler than anyone else GG had known his own age. After a year of this, GG's parents decided to move back into their old house in Lunenburg, Vermont, and they said goodbye to Al. Reunited with his old friends, Kiffin and Dennis, GG bought a drum kit with his Lobster Tub money and got the band back together, adding Dennis Merrill on tambourine. Despite not having a bassist, they still managed to get gigs for dances and other events that I'm sure soon regretted it when they saw them play. They tried to emulate the bands they loved, like Grand Funk Railroad, The Stooges, Alice Cooper, and Black Sabbath. Basically anything loud or mildly destructive sounded good to GG. Despite being back with his old friends, GG was still struggling at school. He'd never really caught up to the other students, and his long hair and habit of wearing women's clothes and underwear, though not always at the same time, made him a frequent target for other kids. GG didn't care. He had decided long ago he didn't want to be friends with the people at his school. As far as he was concerned, they were country bumpkins that lacked the resources or wherewithal to move to somewhere cooler when they got older, which resulted in a lot of fights, and eventually GG and his brother began to view school as slightly more of a part-time endeavor. They'd get up when their parents were getting ready, then as soon as they left, the boys went back to bed, waking up several hours later to begin getting into the day's trouble. I should probably also mention that at this time, GG's sexual proclivities were continuing to escalate. I try to avoid a lot of the details of this era because some of it is pretty unpleasant to repeat or honestly have to hear, but I'll give you some context because it's a big part of who he is and it isn't going to go away. So in high school, GG was masturbating 5 to 6 times a day, which I think we can agree is on the high side. And most upsetting was that he wasn't always alone. Sometimes his brother Merle was there also. Anyway, needless to say, things are not off to a great start for GG's sexual health. Eventually, the boys did find a reason to go to school, though, to make money. They'd become quite good at shoplifting, or at least quite brazen. They would take orders from kids at school, hitchhike to a local shopping center, and then pick up the goods and make the sale after class. Eventually, one of GG's friends got a car, and the group began stealing from homes, camps, and cars during concerts for extra cash. Almost all of that cash went to albums that they hadn't already stolen themselves. Things were going well until one day their parents came home early to find that GG and Merle were not at school. Then, a week later, GG's mom found their stash of all their stolen stuff and called the police on her sons to teach them a lesson. They learned absolutely no lessons, and when sophomore year came around, GG opted to attend a larger high school further away while Merle stayed at their current school for his senior year. This division and girls quickly broke up the band. Guys either had new friends or new girlfriends, or at least in one case, a guy just literally disappeared. GG, on the other hand, couldn't understand any of this. As he saw it, he had the most active libido out of any of them, and he was completely happy to handle things on his own and then get back to making music. But what you gotta understand is, GG had not had a girlfriend up to this point, so he had literally no idea what he was talking about. With the Silver Band broken up, he started a new band called Flame that only lasted a year, because GG returned to his old high school for his junior year and began dating a 7th grader named Sandy, a decision that everyone was very uncomfortable with, not least of which, Sandy's parents. His brother was now working at the shoe factory with his parents, and their friend Al was a roadie for a band named Fox while he finished his senior year. Al got GG a job as the drum tech for the band, and he got to travel with them every weekend and even fill in for the drummer if he was too busy. It was his first taste of real rock and roll, and he didn't waste it. He took the job seriously, and he got to meet a lot of people in the industry throughout New England. After Al graduated, he and Merle began selling LSD and doing a good amount of it themselves. While selling drugs, GG, Merle, and Al decided they would form a band. Still lacking a bassist, they went to a local club and put the word out, and before the night was through, Dennis Willett had joined the band. They named the band Little Sisters Date as a not-so-sly reference to LSD and, quote, younger women. Their words, not mine. Their first gig was for a street fair opening for the band Fox. When they arrived, there were 5,000 people waiting to see Fox play. But first, they got a face full of Little Sisters Date. They played a 15-minute set and, quote, blew the people away, leaving the crowd in awe, end quote. I wasn't able to find out exactly what that means, but according to GG, they broke the rules and didn't sell out. I have no idea how you sell out in one show, but GG was firm they didn't. By his senior year, GG was only becoming more of an outcast. He had long hair and wore what was considered to be outrageous clothing for the time, but honestly, it's pretty tame. I looked at his yearbook photos and they're actually really funny. I highly recommend you Google them. GG thought that he was such a freak, but he looks like most high school kids until he grows his hair really long, and then he combed it for the photo for some reason, and he looks a lot like my 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. White, or possibly Velma from the Scooby-Doo cartoons. You decide. That doesn't mean that GG was just your run-of-the-mill kid. He was a very unusual dude, and only getting more unusual. At one point, GG refused to eat anything he didn't open himself, and he would eat it with the same unwashed fork that he kept in a baggie in the fridge. Yes, in the fridge. He was also still obsessively masturbating with the assistance of magazines, stolen underpants, and on occasion just hanging out with a good friend. Eventually that wasn't enough, and GG began to cultivate a scatological obsession, even going so far as to try to disconnect the toilet in his own home so that it wouldn't flush and he could go in and, quote, enjoy what remained. I did not do any additional research on what that means, and I don't want to know. GG spent most of his time stealing with his bandmates when not practicing. They knew the police were onto them, but lacked the evidence to actually arrest them, and they thought it was funny. When they weren't committing crimes, the band was practicing for gigs they didn't have. GG was even playing enough that he was in need of a new drum kit, and his parents agreed to take him one town over to order it. On the way home, GG's stepdad John lost control on an icy road and spun into an oncoming car. GG's mother shattered her pelvis, GG himself broke his arm, causing the bone to break through the skin, and John only suffered minor bruises. The other driver died at the scene. GG was in the hospital for weeks having multiple surgeries to reconstruct his arm, and then shortly after he had finally gotten out, he burned his hands severely and had to go back into the hospital. I have no idea what he did to burn his hands. All I could find is that he did it within 2 weeks of getting out of the hospital. When he had finally recovered from that, he returned to school to take his finals and realized he had no idea what was on the tests. He hadn't been there for like half a year. Luckily, everybody really kind of hated the kid, and they gave him slightly modified versions to ensure they wouldn't have to put up with another year of GG Allin. So in 1975, GG Allin graduated high school despite hardly attending and learning next to nothing. Out of school, he was met with the harsh reality that he needed to find a job, and his brother had been fired from the shoe factory for constantly missing work to hang out with GG. The boys had no interest in working, but they weren't going to be allowed to live with their parents anymore if they didn't have jobs. So they decided to run the high school play again. They'd get up early every day and go looking for jobs, but instead they just hitchhike to their buddy Al's house, get super fucked up, or just go steal stuff to pawn. One day, after some light shoplifting, they returned to Al's house to drop off their bounty before going to a concert and saw that there was blood all over the floor. Rather than investigate, Al said, quote, "Let's just go to the show. I'll deal with whatever this is later," end quote. It turned out whatever this was that Al's father had killed himself in the house, shooting himself in the head after learning his mother was cheating on him. Who sees blood all over their house and goes to a concert? I still don't understand that. Anyway, eventually their parents figured out GG and his brother hadn't been looking for jobs and gave him 2 weeks to figure it out or get the hell out. So they got jobs at a shoe shop and put out ads for a new guitar player in all the music trades. After a few months, they finally found Jeff Penny, and they formed Malpractice, notably without Al. Eventually, they added one more guitarist named Brian Deemers, who they all kind of hated, but they needed equipment and Deemers was rich, so they agreed to let him in. They immediately began writing new songs in the spirit of MC5 or even the Ramones or kind of maybe some early Kiss with a vague prog rock thing going into it. It took a while, but eventually they even convinced a booker to start getting them gigs, though that didn't last very long. At a high school dance, the band took the stage and began shouting, "Fuck you cunts, fuck school, let's riot," and were dropped from the agent. This would happen so much that the band was forced to work primarily in Maine because the only booker that would have them were out of state, and a lot of those gigs ended up actually costing the band money. They would drive across Maine in a bread truck with no heat, set up for a sound check, only to be told to get the hell out. They were too loud, too weird, and played songs nobody knew. One night, the band got as far as starting their set, only to have the entire room walk out, except for 2 people, Joel Raymond and Peter Suyama. The men explained that they were starting a label and they wanted to make a record with Malpractice. The label, Foo Angel Productions, was working with the Cars, the Real Kids, and one of Gigi's favorite bands, DMZ. The band agreed to sign and went to work in the studio. Gigi and Merle wanted their new songs for the album to be even harder and capture the raw energy of their live shows. Jeff, on the other hand, wanted their songs to be popular and far more song-like. Jeff somehow won the argument, and a single with Love Tunnel and Devil's Triangle was released. I listened to these. They're not bad. They're certainly not outrageous, even for 1977, but I did get the impression the live show was probably more enjoyable. Think about like a way less energetic OCs. It's just middle-of-the-road punk. But no one bought the record, and Malpractice was dead, so Merle and Gigi had to go back to work. Merle at a honey factory and Gigi at a different shoe factory. Still living with their parents, the family moved to Vermont. Somehow Gigi was still dating Sandy, that girl that he began dating when she was in 7th grade and he was in high school, and when she graduated, the two were to be married. But for the time being, Sandy still lived at home with her very disappointed mother. It was great for Gigi. They'd have sex marathons at his house, and then he would take her home to her place, where he would steal Sandy, her sister, her mother, and her grandmother's underpants for when he got home. I don't know why this started, and I cannot stress how pervasive this behavior was in the research. This guy stole underpants constantly, and the grosser the better. Apparently it's a thing. With Malpractice disbanded, the brothers put ads out for a new guitarist with little success. They had new songs and couldn't wait, so they recruited a friend named Peter Hinault to play on the recordings with them. Foo Angel agreed to produce it, and they cut Bored to Death, Beat Beat Beat, and One Man Army. The songs were not released formally as a record, but they were released for review and radio play under the band name The Jabbers. As a guy who didn't really listen to this music, at least Beat 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 is pretty good. I don't necessarily think anybody should seek it out, but it's not bad. The band got a manager/agent named Zark Spleen, and Merle left the band. He and Gigi had been invited to join a Boston band called The Thrills, but Gigi butted heads with another member and refused to join, but Merle said yes and left the Jabbers. Meanwhile, on October 6, 1979, Gigi and Sandy were finally married. They had a brief honeymoon in Montreal and then moved to Manchester, New Hampshire. Instantly, things went to hell. Gigi had a job as a custodian at a nursing home, and Sandy worked at a music store. They quickly realized they couldn't afford their rent and food and had to move into a one-room boarding house on Elm Street over Caesar's Pizza Pad. 2 people in a tiny room is not great, but it's way worse if one of those people is GG Allin. Desperate to keep making music, Gigi took out a loan and released the songs he had recorded with Merle as an EP on his own label, Blood Records. GG Allin and the Jabbers officially had a record out, but there were no Jabbers to speak of. So Gigi put out ads in all the record stores and recruited old friend Al Chappell to play bass. They then added the very loud 14-year-old John Fortin on rhythm guitar and Rob Basso on lead. Gigi had played drums on the EP, but he was eager to abandon the kit and focus solely on being the lead singer. He had big plans and knew he would need to step out from behind the drums to make it happen. So they auditioned about 100 people that either GG hated or they hated him, but eventually found Kevin Duran. Kevin played hard and fast, he could keep up with the band, and so they started practicing every night. Meanwhile, Merle was touring with the Thrills, building a following and opening for bands like the Ramones. Eventually, when GG thought that they were ready, Merle got the Jabbers an opening spot for a weekend with the Thrills. The band took the stage and began its assault. Playing as loudly as possible, they thrashed about, knocking over amps, breaking lights, and just generally smashing into everything. GG launched himself at the audience over and over, attempting to cause as much chaos and destruction as possible. And the debut had the desired effect. The Boston Phoenix called GG the, quote, madman of Manchester, and the Jabbers were on the scene. The next gig was at a place called Club 28, and it was a problem from the start. When the band started sound check, the owner immediately told them it was way too loud and he was going to have to turn things down. So GG turned every single amp up as loud as it would possibly go, and then quietly slipped backstage to prepare. As the crowd filtered in, the band chugged vodka and got high backstage. GG, quietly despising the well-dressed patrons, sat squinting in the corner planning his assault. For some reason, the venue had set up tables for the crowd to enjoy this punk show, and that turned out to be a pretty bad decision. The band hit the stage and began playing Bored to Death, a really solid punk song that you would not sit down to enjoy. GG grabbed a microphone and made for the audience. First, he took out the entire front row of tables with his body, tossing drinks and audience members to the floor. He then began working his way to the back, hurling beer bottles as hard as he could at everyone he could find. All the while, he's switching between song lyrics and screaming, "Get back here, you pussy cunts, what are you afraid of?" And despite multiple attempts from the club owner, the band refused to stop playing until the police arrived and forced them to leave. This was a pretty common Jabber show. They went on like this for a while, GG while still working his custodial job, usually while on speed during the day, and then they would do gigs at night. Each show seemed to kind of escalate things a little bit further, and it was causing some tension in the band. It was clear that most of them thought GG was getting a little too out of hand and distracting everybody from the actual music. Eventually, rehearsals devolved into a nightly fistfight, and they all stopped speaking outside of the actual gigs. The band had been kicked out of so many clubs in New Hampshire by this point, the police warned them that charges would be filed if the Jabbers kept doing shows. Fed up, Kevin quit the band, so they asked Merle's roommate, Mackie, to fill in on drums. But they had another problem. Their reputation was making it almost impossible to get gigs anywhere near them. Hoping to let things cool down, the band turned their attention to recording an album. GG reached out to New York underground musician David Peel, and he agreed to put the album out on his Orange Records label. In 1980, the Jabbers hit the studio, cut 10 tracks in 2 days, and the album Always Was, Is, and Always Shall Be was complete. Their next show was at Lowell University, and how this happened is a total mystery to me. Needless to say, their manager Zark Spleen did not tell the school's administration what they were in for. The college students were standing about socializing when the band took the stage. GG grabbed a mic and screamed, "You fucking motherfuckers, we're ready to play for you cunts, so pay attention," end quote. He then pulled down his pants and began masturbating at the crowd. Not in front of, at. There's a difference. When this somehow didn't cause every person to run screaming, GG began picking up bottles and chairs and whipping them at the crowd, screaming, "Let's start a riot." That did work. Students began to pick up chairs and throw them back at the band. By the third song, the police in riot gear were filtering into the auditorium. The police demanded that they leave or face arrest. Now, the band did leave the building, but not the campus. The problem was, they had heard that there was going to be a real rage or a party later that night, and they had to check it out. So they waited till the cops cleared out, hid their van in the bushes, and went to the party. The band got drunker and higher and louder, and suddenly, the Lowell Police Department was kicking in the door and charging all 5 of them with criminal trespassing, indecent exposure, disorderly conduct, and inciting a riot. All of which pretty accurate. Their bail was set at $100, but GG didn't have that kind of cash and was stuck in there for a few days. When he did finally get it cobbled together and get home, Sandy was pissed. They did not have $100 to be wasting on bail. She had been taking college and modeling classes while GG was out breaking things and getting fucked up. She was working to better their lives, and he didn't really seem to care. After the charges in Lowell, everyone in the band was pretty pissed off at GG. Their gigs were becoming more predictable. You didn't know if the place would get destroyed, if GG would fight the crowd, or if the band would just get into a fist fight with each other and not play any songs. All were possible, if not likely. Sensing the need for a break, the band agreed to stop touring entirely until the record was released. This was a great idea. That gave everyone time to cool down and come back together to celebrate their debut album that they had made so many months back. Turns out GG had slightly different plans. He had reached out to Orange Records with a few modifications. First, he removed the only 3 songs that were by Rob and Al, and he replaced them with the songs from the EP by the old Jabbers, who weren't even in the band anymore. Then he changed the band name from GG Allin and the Jabbers to just GG Allin. And finally, he swapped out the album art with all the members to a single shot of just himself. After he had made all these changes, he told absolutely no one. So when the album did come out, everybody was beyond furious. And somehow no one quit. They just kept fighting and finding passive-aggressive and not so passive-aggressive ways to fuck with each other. By now, the Jabbers had a roadie/drummer-in-waiting by the name of Jim Danger, who delighted in torturing the current drummer Rob with GG during practice, just to see if they could get him to fight them. Interested in trying to make another album, GG got in touch with musician and producer Genya Raven. The two hit it off instantly when they had met and began talking on the phone all the time. It didn't take long before GG was masturbating to their phone calls while Sandy was sleeping in the other room. It's hard to know exactly how much of this is any sort of attraction to Genya or if it was just GG serving his compulsion. I've glossed over it because it's gross and excessive, but he is still masturbating like everywhere, and it's weird and not always in the most legal places, like outside of high schools, allegedly, but also not allegedly. Genya put GG in touch with the band Cheetah, and the two went on tour together with the Jabbers as the opening act. When Cheetah's drummer quit after the lead singer spent all their money on drugs, GG stepped in and pulled double duty between the bands for both shows. It was probably why their shows actually went really well. GG was too busy to get fucked up or too tired to create too much destruction. He was still stage diving and swinging from the ceiling, but they actually got to finish their sets. They played all of the songs. It also helped too that the crowd was starting to understand what they were signing up for. A group of guys, in fact, calling themselves the Goons and led by a man who referred to himself only as Dick Urine, began to show up at every gig, ready for GG to lead them in a destructive parade of chaos. They'd flip tables, break bottles, and generally just beat the shit out of GG, which is exactly what he wanted. During one of these sets, GG was covering the New York Dolls pills, and a groupie ran on stage and began pouring some kind of pills down his throat, something that GG enjoyed so much he was sure to repeat it at as many shows as possible. Around this time, now 15-year-old John was forced to leave the band by his father, who did not approve of what his son had been doing, or the band. Down a man, GG turned his attention to recording a 45 to follow up the LP. He wanted to record in New York with David Peel producing. Peel agreed and even sweetened the pot. For $50, ex-MC5 guitarist Wayne Kramer would play on the songs. Then GG realized that somehow he had ex-MC5 drummer Dennis Thompson's telephone number, and that guy agreed to play if he'd buy him a one-way ticket to New York City. So GG, Al, and Rob took off to New York to record some songs and meet some idols. It couldn't have gone better as far as GG was concerned. They recorded 3 songs, Gimme Some Head, Dead or Alive, and Occupational Hazard in one day, and spent the weekend partying like rock stars before the Jabbers had to return to their much less glamorous lives in New Hampshire. Gigs had been hard to come by in general, and when they got back from recording in New York, they were officially impossible. And I do mean officially. The Liquor Commission of New Hampshire began threatening to pull the liquor license of any club that allowed GG and the Jabbers to play, effectively blackballing the band from playing any more shows in their home state. Luckily, the Rat, a club in Boston, would continually allow the Jabbers to come and destroy their club. When the 45 they recorded in New York was released, it saw pockets of radio play and even some enthusiastic praise. The Village Voice and magazines like it across the country raved about the song's raw nature of the band, while other people saw it as a mediocre punk band with subpar vocals and slightly gross lyrics. I should mention that. The lyrics are kind of gross. Behind the scenes, the band was falling apart. They had to have 2 brothers fill in when Mackey and Fortin left the band, sick of GG's bullshit. They blamed him for not being able to get any more shows, and they were mostly right. The brothers only lasted a couple of months before they also got frustrated and quit the band, being replaced by Chris LeMay and Steve Kay. But even with the new lineup, the other band members wanted to pull back on the stage antics and focus on the music. What they didn't understand is for GG, it was all about the antics, and the music was just there to support it. With the exception of a few standbys, the Jabbers continued to get booked, booted, and banned from one club after another, mostly in Massachusetts, but not exclusively. How they even managed to keep getting booked anywhere is completely beyond me. By now, Dick Urine had formed the so-called Goon Squad, and they would make flyers for local shows in New England to celebrate GG. But the Goons only made things worse. At an early show at the Living Room in Rhode Island, they brought eggs, penny rolls, and maple syrup to hurl at the band during the show. Then they began mixing beer with half and half creamer and spraying the whole place down. The show lasted exactly 3 songs before the power was cut and the band was kicked out. Basically, everyone not named GG was pretty bummed that they didn't get to play music and that they had just been pelted with a bunch of garbage by their supposed fans. GG thought it was an unmitigated success. He was stoked people brought things to hurl at him and that they were hanging on his every word. The next show at Media Workshop in Boston ended even worse. They were on the bill with Gangrene, the Freeze, and the Foos. Foolishly, the Jabbers opened the show and proceeded to destroy everything, first smashing everything on the stage and then turning their attention to the stage itself. At the end, GG emerged from a pile of wood that used to be the stage, covered in blood. The goons were sort of like GG's personal Hell's Angels, and they were really dangerous people. When a Jabber show was just turning into a 30-person fistfight thanks to GG's demands to start rioting and hurling fists and bottles at everybody, the goons would act on behalf of the club as security, literally knocking people out and hurling their semi-conscious bodies out the front door. Never mind the fact that these were some of the same people that were responsible for getting the crowd fired up and likely throwing one of the first punches. They'd spit on GG and they'd kick him in the guts and bring shaving cream and jelly beans and start whipping them at everybody, all while mediocre to decent punk music is sort of being played in the background. It's shocking how little the band had to pay for the damage they caused, but I did find one example of a club called Mavericks in downtown Boston. It was a pizza/burrito restaurant by day and a club by night. The night that they had GG and the Jabbers come play is rumored to be the last show that was ever to be held at this club. Here's what happened. First, they tipped over garbage barrels and garbage was smeared all over the club and GG. Next, ketchup was sprayed all over the crowd, stage, and ceiling. Then came the glass breaking. First bottles, then glasses, then anything. Next, GG got in that glass and really rolled around till he was nice and bloody. And if that wasn't enough, the goons then ripped 4 palm trees from their pots and began to beat GG until he was a bloody pulp on the floor. Rounding out the performance, GG hung from the wiring in the ceiling and managed to rip out most of the electrical by the end of the set. After this performance, GG got a bill for $2,800, which of course he never paid. So you kind of have to ask, why would you allow this to happen to your club? But they did. And the best I can tell you is a lot of these clubs were in Boston, and those people are maniacs. Don't deny it, Boston. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, GG laid in bed for about 3 days after that show. Well, technically he laid next to the bed. See, he was covered in garbage and blood, and Sandy rightfully did not want that in her bed. Why didn't he just shower, you might be wondering? Well, that's because GG Allin had stopped showering by this point, and if Sandy wanted him clean and not bleeding all over her bed, she literally had to bribe him. So he slept on the floor. The band played one more show in Boston before the clubs got wise and GG blackballed from another city. Guitarist Chris LeMay could see that things were only escalating and decided to leave the band. His last show with the Jabbers was at Ron's House of Punk in New Haven, Connecticut with 4 other bands. And things did indeed escalate. By coincidence, in attendance the night of the show were several ex-biker paraplegics along with active bikers. Not the sort of people you should actively accost in the name of your art. The show started fine because GG was in a van messing around with some chick when the owner forced them to get started. Luckily, Dick Urin was in attendance and he covered vocal duty. Finally, when GG did arrive, Dick introduced him and GG took the stage, where he immediately pulled down his pants and began urinating on the crowd, in the name of art. He alternated between epileptic fits and demanding women perform oral sex on him until the police arrived and forced the band out of the club under threat of arrest. On the way home to Manchester that night, GG and Rob got into a fight and Rob was thrown out of the car. GG claims that's the last time he or anyone ever saw Rob Basso. Back home, things were equally a mess. GG had lost his job and Sandy was tired of his shit. She kept thinking he would grow out of it or get a little less intense, but the opposite was happening. He was becoming even more GG Allin. So they went to counseling for about a year, which resulted in alternating silence and screaming matches from GG, but very little improvement to his marriage. Chris and Rob had left, but Al and Steve had stuck around, and they picked up a guitarist also named Steve. GG finally felt like he had the band behind him he needed and could really focus his energy on performance. Heading into 1982, the Jabbers continued to get booked in New York, Boston, a little in New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, although they rarely completed a set and most clubs did not have them back a second time. On top of all the other things I mentioned so far, GG was spitting on people, licking faces, punching women, groping everyone, and inviting everyone to find new ways to make him bleed, including one night at a straight edge show where they literally ripped boards from the stage and beat GG with them with the nails still sticking out of the ends. He finished the set with tiny holes all over him and the concert hall covered in blood. Eventually, GG became too risky of a gamble that no one wanted to book him or the Jabbers for a show. With no money and little options, GG and Sandy had to move back to Littleton to live rent-free above GG's parents in the spare apartment. Before they left, the band recorded a 4-song EP comprised of No Rules, A Fuck Up, New York City Tonight, and Up Against the Wall. This was released by Orange Records in 1982 as the No Rules EP. It's pretty good punk music, I gave it a listen, nothing crazy, but they play hard and it's not bad. Back in Littleton, Sandy got a job at an accounting firm and GG at a bakery where he would regularly steal food and cash from the register. He wasn't sure what his next move was going to be until he met guitar player Kevin Kelsey, aka Killer Kelsey. Kelsey knew who GG was and said he knew a guy who would give them free studio time if he let them play bass in the band. GG didn't waste the chance for free recording time and wrote 5 new songs. They recorded Drink, Fight, and Fuck, Convulsions, Hard Candy Cock, Out for Blood, and I Don't Give a Shit, with GG on drums, and called themselves the Scumfucks. GG would release this as a self-titled EP on his Blood Records in 1983, but it didn't really lead to anything. Remarkably, GG is the one who finally ended things with Sandy and asked for a divorce. She got all the material possessions, and GG took some cash and a trunk with some clothes. He moved back to Manchester and slept on the floor at Al's for a bit before getting a job at a dry cleaner's and moving into a boarding house. It had a communal bathroom and kitchen, but the worse it was, the better for GG. He felt he was scum and he deserved to live like scum. He ate peanut butter sandwiches on white bread, pissed in jars, and literally never showered. Also worth noting, by this point GG's drinking whiskey almost all day, every day, going out with Al at night, and continuing to drink until blacking out. On one of these evenings, GG met Lisa Granoff, a completely normal person who took pity on GG and wanted to take care of him. She'd take him out, buy him drinks, and bring him food all the time. She came from a good home and thought she could fix this young man. Shockingly, once again it was GG that told her to please stop coming by all the time and mothering him. Now, the real reason he said that was that he wanted to have sex with other women that were not her, and when she kept dropping by unannounced, it was ruining that. But this didn't deter Lisa, and eventually GG just gave up and started staying at her place while openly cheating on her. Even when GG left her in a pair of handcuffs after some early morning role play for 8 hours straight while he went to work, she just gave him the silent treatment rather than breaking up with him. And this was not a charismatic man, so I do not know what was wrong with her. She was clearly a broken person, and I feel very bad. Pleased with the EP he cut with the Scumfucks, GG was eager to put out an LP, so he began working on new songs. Also, since the Jabbers never really broke up, GG would go practice with them while working on Scumfuck songs of his own. Although to be fair, GG didn't really see much of a difference. He was the band, and everyone around him were just the people that were available at that moment. Now, as if having Lisa and a train of other women from various clubs wasn't enough for a smelly lunatic living in a boarding house, there was somehow another woman in GG's life. His friend and sometimes roadie, Jimmy, had introduced him to a skinny, nervous woman named Jean. Jean was skinny and nervous because she liked to shoot cocaine. GG had done his share of cocaine, but never using needles. But he liked Jean and she liked shooting coke, so GG wanted to see if he liked shooting coke. So they went to her friend Angie's and shot up with cocaine for about 12 hours straight. When it was all gone, GG suggested they get more and do it again. And ideally, never be not doing it, ever, until they were all dead or ran out of money. Jean suggested maybe he try to take it slow. In between jamming with the Jabbers, shooting cocaine, and having unconventional sex with people, GG completed the Scumfucks LP called Eat My Fuck, or simply EMF. It was released in 1984 and got somewhat mixed reviews. GG was pioneering what I like to call porno punk, complete with album art depicting a cartoon penis ejaculating. Many record stores completely refused to carry it, and most radio stations refused to play it. But that didn't matter to GG. He kept doing drugs and practicing with the Jabbers anyway. In fact, the band's new drummer Mike was also a speed dealer, so a lot of times he could practice and do drugs. When the British band GBH came to town, the Casbah Club was doing an all-ages show. The club wanted the Jabbers to take the middle slot between the Abortion Squad and GBH, and since no liquor would be served, the liquor board couldn't threaten the club for allowing GG to perform. The band agreed, and instantly hype in the city began to build. Old friends, bandmates, and goons all showed up for the show, and it was sold out. The abortion squad opened with some hardcore thrash metal, and then GG hit the stage. He began taunting the crowd and threatening to take his penis out. The crowd writhed and violently smashed into each other, anticipating GG's next move. A woman came on stage, and GG grabbed her by the hair and ripped her shirt off, exposing her bare breasts. Now, it's going to sound crazy, but everyone was thrilled about this, including the girl. That's what they wanted to have happen. GG bit, scratched, and kicked the crowd and himself until he was smeared with his own blood. 15 minutes later, they were gone, and GBH was wondering what the fuck just happened. After the show, GG ignored both Gene and Lisa, who were there to see him, and instead, he did cocaine and groped a teenage girl he had just met named Janie Jones. Yes, you heard that right. It was that common that I can just say casually he decided to grope a teenage girl. This is not a good man. Anyway, while the show was a success, it was clear to the band members that weren't GG that they weren't going anywhere, and they were getting tired of it. A few weeks later, what was left of the Jabbers played their final show together. They attempted to recreate the magic from a month prior at the Casbah, but everything went wrong. GG was picking fights in the crowd, he kept missing lines, and at some point the crowd completely ripped his pants off, and he didn't get back to the microphone on time to sing any of his songs. The rest of the band left immediately after the show, embarrassed by what had just happened. GG, of course, stuck around to talk to women. One of those women was named Tracy, and she introduced herself to GG as, quote, that girl whose shirt you ripped off the other night at the Casbah. Now, he only got her number that night, but soon the two would begin dating. And by dating, I mean getting blackout drunk and fucking on a mattress for hours. But, to each their own. It was a tumultuous relationship from the start. Both Tracy and GG would get drunk and do crazy or awful things to each other. There was the night GG hung Tracy out the window by her ankles, or when Tracy got back at him by ripping up all of GG's new songs and burning the pieces for revenge. While it was sometimes funny, a lot of the times it wasn't. GG could be straight abusive, leaving Tracy with more than a few bruises to explain to her parents when she came home. By this point, GG was spending almost all of his money on booze and drugs, and had to leave his boarding house in the middle of the night for a different boarding house across town that was even shittier. It was bigger, but it smelled worse and had literally all the cockroaches. This was also around the time that Tracy became pregnant with GG's child. Her friends helped her to raise the money for an abortion, and they drove to Concord for the procedure. While Tracy was in the doctor's office, GG met a guy waiting for his girl, and they decided to go to the car and get super high. When they got back, Tracy was in the waiting room alone and crying, super pissed off that GG would leave her. Somehow that was still not enough, and Tracy and GG stayed together. They stopped getting invited to parties because GG was always drunk and starting shit with random people. He was living on cheap whiskey and corned beef hash while still refusing any sort of personal hygiene. He'd poop in plastic bags and then just fling them in the corner of his room rather than walk down the hall and use the toilet like a person. Despite this hermit-like lifestyle, GG did go to the Casbah Club most nights. He'd get blackout drunk and wander around being ignored by pretty much everybody. And then if he didn't make it home, you could usually find him passed out behind the Dunkin' Donuts or a nearby alley. He'd wake up, go to work at the dry cleaners, vomit through most of the morning, and then get back to some early afternoon drinking. For at least half a year, he went on like this, not playing music with anyone. Unbeknownst to GG, Al and Zark were now playing together in a band with a drummer named Tim Toms. It was a good little band, but they needed a lead singer. So one night, they all went over to GG's room and asked if he could behave himself enough to be their lead. Allegedly, they even volunteered to play as his band, going on as GG Allin, as long as GG could behave. GG agreed, and they all went to talk to the managers of the Casbah Club to see if they could get a second chance. For some reason, the managers agreed if GG promised to behave and allowed him to do a show. The Liquor Commission heard about this show and threatened to pull the club's license if they let GG go on stage. The Casbah manager assured them that this was a new GG Allin. They had spoken with him, he was going to be well behaved, and the show could go on as planned without concern. The band practiced furiously in the lead up to the show, adding some new songs GG had been working on, and they felt like they were ready to hit the stage. The night of the show, when the opener was wrapping up, GG was backstage with Al Slime, the bassist for a band called Nightmare, doing cocaine and getting psyched for his return. 500 people had packed into the club to see GG. The band went out and played a 5-minute intro before GG hit the stage in a jockstrap, garters, and a black robe. He ran out on stage, picked a random girl in the crowd, shouted bitch in her face, and spit a mouthful of beer into her eyes. It appeared that GG might not keep his promise. He then grabbed the pipes running along the ceiling and swung himself past the first row of tables, crashing into the waitress and spilling everything she was carrying. Once back on stage so he could sing, GG began kicking people and cutting himself. Next, he dropped his jockstrap, played with himself a little bit, and chased several people around the club, trying to fight them in the nude. It took about 4 songs before the plug was pulled, and by then the crowd had been thinned out to about 20 devout GG fans. Everyone was pretty pissed. The band left without saying a word to GG, but the club manager at the Casbah had plenty to say. GG didn't care. He wasn't interested in doing anything for anybody else. After that disaster, GG was without a band again and decided to kill time by constantly doing cocaine and drinking. He and Tracy were still dating and would go to see hardcore shows at a club called Channel in Boston. They were all ages shows, and when they got there, most of the time GG was more interested in the girls than the music. Eventually, Tracy even stopped going with him because it was so disgusting. He'd get gacked out of his mind and start feeling up other women in front of her. On one occasion, he took an underage girl to the middle of the slam pit and attempted to rape her. To be clear, that is the word that is used in multiple accounts of this interaction. GG Allin, not a good guy. While in Boston, GG would often stay with his friend Mucus from a band called Mucus Gravy. The two would go on wild coke and alcohol benders that Tracy would stay home and avoid. When GG was at home, Al Slime would stop by with his cocaine and a whole bunch of free time. Eventually, GG asked Al if he wanted to play with him in the Scumfucks. Al was friends with Tim Toms, who had been playing with GG at that last show at the Casbah, and was one of the few people that thought it was kinda awesome, so he was in too. They set up a 4-track recorder, invited some people, and had a recording party. The result was the following 4 songs: I'm Gonna Rape You, I Wanna Fuck Your Brains Out, Teacher's Pet, and Devil's Prayer. GG released the song as a 4-track EP on his label, Blood Records, a few months later in 1985 under the name GG Allin and the Scumfucks. GG's voice on this EP is noticeably more ragged, and he's replaced any attempt at singing with just pretty much shouting. After releasing the EP, GG went with Tracy to Rhode Island to see a Ramones show, but was kicked out after he was crowd surfing into Dee Dee. While they were at the show, GG's house burned down. They drove up just in time to see that the half of the building that contained GG's room was gone. With literally nothing, GG was officially a homeless person. He would try to sleep in Tracy's car when he could and sit at McDonald's sipping spiked coffee to kill the morning. But GG had already been spending most of his days just kind of wandering the streets and meeting other transients and addicts, so that part wasn't much different. He just couldn't take him back to his place because it was a pile of ashes. Eventually, the city gave him $200 to relocate, and GG had his friend Chico secure him a room at an even shittier boarding house. The reason Chico did it is because if any landlord got even just one look at GG, it was an immediate no. He was unwashed, unkempt, and completely unapologetic about anything. The room was cramped, but was a place to get loaded and have sex with Tracy and Lisa and a whole slew of other women with very low self-esteem. Which I should mention was a very unconventional proposition. You better be ready to try some things outside your comfort zone if you're having sex with GG Allin. We'll leave it at that for now. GG was seeing Tracy most consistently, who was still living at home, but the two decided to get a place together. And as you would imagine, GG is the exact kind of roommate you'd expect. He'd make love to his inflatable sex dolls in the living room, he'd have phone sex with other women in front of Tracy just to make her angry, and generally was just one of the dirtiest human beings you've ever met. One day, while out walking the streets, as he often did, GG met a skinny, pale woman named Carrie. Carrie had just moved to the neighborhood after having an abortion and losing a friend to a drug overdose. She was straight edge on account of that OD, but GG liked her anyway. He started bringing her around the apartment, and eventually Tracy got sick of it, and she said she'd start seeing other guys. Once that happened, the apartment turned into a total war zone. They'd compete to see who could be the most obnoxious about the people they were banging, and you should not try to get into an obnoxious off with GG Allin. You are going to lose. He'd come in and just literally smash everything in the living room if Tracy had people over, or just start beating the shit out of her if he felt like he had been slighted in some way. Now, Tracy also had a tendency to get pretty drunk and fling phones and plates at GG if he'd been out with other women. Through all of this, though, they were still, quote, dating, or at least having sex with each other in the same house. Clearly in an abusive relationship, Tracy's friends tried to break them up. One friend named Jackie even got as far as moving Tracy out of the apartment while GG was at work, but eventually he found her and talked her into moving back in. According to GG, he was more concerned about paying the rent than maintaining the relationship, but he's also a well-documented liar, so it could have been both. Even after the police were called multiple times due to GG's violence, Tracy still continued to cover for him and would not leave. Meanwhile, on the band side of things, the new Scumfucks wanted to record more music and play gigs. They rented the gear they didn't have, a 4-track recorder, and a rehearsal space in Boston. In one day, they cut an entire 12-song album. Given they did it in a day, it's really not bad. The vocals are tough, but it's listenable, and there's some really good guitar solos. It was released in 1985 as You'll Never Tame Me on Blood Records to mixed reviews. Critics either thought it was pure trash or an instant classic of gritty street music and the American experience of the 80s. I think it's closer to garbage, but, to each their own. Next, Al tried to get the scumfucks some gigs. Knowing Gigi had a reputation, he went to the sleaziest club in town called the Zoo. They agreed to put on the show as long as the band didn't promote it too much and asked to try to keep things low-key. So the band made an understated flyer that said, quote, "Come and see GG Allin and the Scumfucks, the band that will rape and fuck your 10-year-old daughter," end quote. I apologize for that. They passed one of these flyers out to literally every person they could find, and when a concerned mother saw that her daughter was holding an invitation to a rape, she called the police. They shut down the show before anyone could ever take the stage, and they literally banned Gigi from playing. With little options in town and fighting with at least 2 of his girlfriends, Gigi bought a 30-day Greyhound bus pass with the intention of bringing the GG Allin experience across America. Before he could leave, Tracy informed him that she was pregnant again. This time, Gigi said, "Why don't you go ahead and have it? I could die at any moment. Wouldn't want to waste this." But he added, "I do have this 30-day Greyhound pass, so I'm gonna need to go and, you can figure it out." The plan was to do shows in Ohio, Illinois, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and then back to Manchester. When Gigi set out, the Ohio trip was canceled before he even got a mile down the road. So he hopped on a different bus to Peoria and arrived on July 30th, 1985, a day before the show was scheduled to take place. This was going to be a very special show because it marked the addition of a new trick to the GG Allin stage performance that would soon become a signature move and synonymous with the name GG Allin. You see, Gigi was playing these shows with his friend Bloody Mess and his band Hate. The day before the show, at Gigi's request, Bloody bought a big bottle of X-Lax, a laxative here in the United States. Bloody probably assumed Gigi was a heroin addict and just needed some relief, but Gigi had a very different idea in mind. Have to wait to find out what that is, folks. That is the end of the GG Allin Solocast Part 1. I hope you're enjoying it. It's pretty gross, but hey, I warned you. We'll pick up next week with Part 2, where things get really, really interesting. Hope you're enjoying it. As I mentioned, for as gross as Part 1 is, Part 2 is 100% grosser. So strap in. Hope you return for Part 2. And then, of course, our good friend Timothy will return to the show anew. We've already got a prep-episode lined up. I hope everyone's excited. If you've made it this far, I'm sure you are. As always, I mentioned it up top. If you could, throw the 5 stars in there. We really appreciate it. Wherever it is you do your podcasting. Rate, review, subscribe, follow, etc. We've got a subreddit. We've got a Discord server. We're on Instagram. That's HatePod. Twitter's Album HatePod. I'm G Harvey Tweets. hatePodMail@gmail.com. You know all the things. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this. Join me next week for the exciting conclusion. For Why I Hate This Album, I have been one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey.
There's cowboys running through my dreams. Nothing's quite the way it seems. I joined the Navy, got kicked out in a week. My facial features aren't distinct. Try to find some meaning in these songs. The genius is a genius, got it wrong. No, it's a lobster murder sex thing. It's the bleaching of the rear. A full assault on both your ears. The riffs are too repetitive. The lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides. The cover art's a mess. Listen to it for a week. Now that week has passed. It's the Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.